The city stretched out before me, its skyline a maze of steel and glass that seemed to gleam even under the gray sky. I hadn't yet found peace in this apartment, this temporary home that was meant to give me space and time to figure out who I was outside of my family's expectations. The apartment was a reflection of me, functional, sterile, not yet lived in. The walls, white and bare, echoed in a way that felt lonely. But it was mine. That fact alone was a small comfort. I was standing by the window, staring out at the morning haze that seemed to settle on the city like a blanket, muffling the usual chaos. I watched the world move while I stood still, disconnected, my mind heavy with the memories I couldn't shake. No matter how many hours I spent alone in this space, I couldn't escape the pull of the past. The calls, the messages, the demands. They had always been there, pulling me back, a tether I couldn't break, no matter how tightly I tried to hold on to myself. I had always been the dependable one, the one they turned to when everything fell apart. And for a long time, I had believed that this was my role, that it was my duty to hold everything together. My family needed me. My parents needed me. I had convinced myself that without me, they wouldn't be able to survive. But then I started to wonder, had they needed me? Or had they just depended on me? The distinction, though small, felt monumental. I didn't want to think that my entire existence had been reduced to a lifeline they pulled on when they were drowning, only to discard when it suited them. It wasn't like I hadn't noticed the signs before. The casual requests for money, the silent judgments, the constant undercurrent of guilt whenever I voiced a need of my own. But I had brushed it off. They were family after all. And family was supposed to come first, right? That idea had been drilled into me since childhood. It was a mantra I had clung to even when it suffocated me. Family first. No matter what. No matter how much it hurt. No matter how much it cost me. But something inside me snapped the day I found out they had been lying to me about everything. About the money, about their plans, about their so-called emergencies. I had always assumed that I was giving out of love. But as the days passed and I dug deeper into their lies, I realized that what I had been giving wasn't just money, it was my entire sense of self. I had been sold on the idea that my worth was tied to how much I could provide, how much I could do for them. The truth, as I found out, was a painful thing to face. And when the investigator's report came back, I wasn't surprised. I should have been, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt a cold rush of clarity. They had taken from me not just my savings, but my life. I had handed them pieces of myself on a silver platter, all for the sake of an idea of family that didn't even exist. I had been naive, but not anymore. The investigation report was detailed, far more than I had expected. It outlined years of financial manipulation, payments for extravagant purchases masked as business needs, offshore accounts, and loans I had never known about. My father had always called me when he needed help, but this was different. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a calculated strategy to drain me. And I had been complicit, all under the guise of love and responsibility. I remember sitting in the small coffee shop where I had met the investigator, the papers spread out on the table in front of me. Each document, each piece of evidence, hit me harder than the last. It wasn't just the numbers. It was the manipulation, the lies, the way I had been played like a pawn in their game. At first, I didn't know what to do with the truth. I felt like I was suffocating under its weight. It was so much to process. I wanted to ignore it, pretend like it didn't exist. But the truth had already set its roots inside me, and there was no turning back. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, a distant echo of the times she had guilt me into action. You're all we have, you know. You're the one who can fix everything. But no more. I wasn't the one who could fix them. And I wasn't going to keep enabling their mistakes. They had taken too much from me already. My time, my energy, my future. I had given them everything. But I wasn't giving them any more. The quiet in the apartment was suffocating, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't a peaceful silence like the one that comes after a long day's work, where you finally get a chance to breathe. No, this was the kind of silence that settled like a weight on your chest, pressing down harder every time you tried to move, to breathe, to think. It was the silence of everything unraveling. And in that silence, I could hear every moment I had ignored, every warning I had dismissed. I was still processing the report, the facts, The overwhelming confirmation of everything I'd suspected but refused to face head-on. It felt like the entire foundation of my life had cracked. My family, the people I thought I could trust above all others, had turned out to be the very ones who would hurt me the most. The things I had given, my time, my money, my heart, had been nothing more than tools they used to manipulate and control me. And I had let it happen. I had let myself become a lifeline for people who had no intention of reciprocating. The guilt was a constant companion, one that I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. It was this heavy, persistent thing that wrapped around my thoughts, telling me that if I just gave a little more, if I just tried harder, they would change. But the report told me what I had refused to admit, that I had been taken advantage of, used to line their pockets, and that my kindness had been mistaken for weakness. And then, that night, the knock came. It wasn't a simple knock, the kind you get when someone is here to visit or share a friendly hello. This was different. The knock on my door was heavy, like it carried a demand, a force behind it that demanded action, demanded I respond. I could hear it echo down the hallway of my apartment. My heart skipped a beat. The sense of urgency, of something sinister, gripped me. At first, I thought about ignoring it. I thought maybe it was just a mistake. But then, the knock came again, louder and more insistent. It wasn't a request, it was a command. My pulse quickened, the familiar dread creeping in. I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. Kevin, my father's lawyer. The same man who had been a constant presence throughout the years, always there with a smooth smile and the subtle pressure to do what was expected. Always talking about family duty and responsibility, as if those words meant anything when they were wielded as tools of manipulation. I had always done what they wanted, always been there, always the one to pick up the pieces. But this time, I wasn't going to open the door. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, my fingers trembling just slightly as I gripped the handle. It would have been so easy to give in, to give him what he wanted, to let him in. But I couldn't do that anymore. I had come to a realization in the weeks leading up to this moment. I had spent so long trying to please everyone, trying to be the person who held things together, that I had lost myself in the process. I was exhausted. I was done. I wasn't going to let them do this to me anymore. I wasn't going to let Kevin, or anyone else, dictate my life. The Ring camera on my door flashed green, indicating it was active. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the button and spoke through the speaker, my voice calm but firm. "You're trespassing. This is being recorded. Leave now." There was silence on the other side, a stillness that stretched out, leaving me wondering if he would try to argue or if he would simply walk away. I didn't care either way. The door remained shut. I watched as Kevin stood there for what felt like an eternity. His fists were clenched at his sides, his face a picture of barely contained anger. His eyes burned with something that I could no longer place: resentment, fear, frustration, or perhaps all of them mixed together. I could feel his gaze through the door, as if he were trying to push through, break me down with his presence alone. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. A full minute passed before he turned abruptly and walked away. I could see him in the camera's view, his shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no further movement. He had made his attempt, and now he was leaving. I stood frozen for a moment longer, my mind racing. I had expected some sort of confrontation, some attempt to manipulate me into opening the door, to make me feel guilty for not letting him in. But instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. A victory, however small, was mine. The next morning, Megan filed for a temporary restraining order. I had been hesitant at first, unsure whether this would make things worse or if it would truly bring the closure I needed. But I realized then that I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't doing this to punish them. I was doing it for myself. I needed to protect myself, and that meant drawing a line. For the first time in years, I was choosing to put myself first. The papers were served to Kevin within 48 hours. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, not exactly. But I did feel something like the beginning of freedom. I could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that they were no longer in control of me. But that wasn't the end of it. No, it was just the beginning. The weeks after the restraining order felt like a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The relief came from knowing that I had taken the first step, that I had finally drawn a boundary. The anticipation, however, was much more insidious. It lingered, like a dark cloud on the horizon, waiting for the next storm. And I could feel it coming. The silence I had so desperately longed for after that night of Kevin's visit wasn't something I could sustain. It wasn't real peace. It was the kind of silence that only happens when everyone knows something has changed, but no one dares to acknowledge it yet. I couldn't remember the last time I had experienced a full day without some form of manipulation creeping into my life, some kind of message or request disguised as concern. But as the days passed, the silence grew more uncomfortable, more suffocating. And that's when the phone calls began. I could see their names on my caller ID. My mother, my father's lawyer, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Each one had their part to play in the drama that I had spent my life trying to avoid. The messages they left were all the same, though, a blend of guilt, sorrow, and desperation. I was the villain in their eyes. I was the one who had walked away, who had chosen herself over them. Your father's condition is getting worse. My mother's voice rang in my ears, soft and broken, just like it always did. We need you here. You know we can't do this without you. Please, darling, I don't know how much longer we can hold on. I heard it, the emotional pull, the accusation wrapped in the guise of concern. Her voice, always fragile, always playing on my compassion. I knew what was coming. She was playing her favorite card, the one where my guilt would override my reason. It wasn't the first time she'd used it. I had heard it for years, every time she wanted something from me. I felt a flicker of doubt, but only for a moment. I had been vulnerable to this kind of manipulation for as long as I could remember, but not anymore. No, I had already made my choice, even if it meant facing the storm that was coming. I deleted the message. There was no hesitation this time. Then came the letters. My father's lawyer, Kevin, started sending me formal notices. They were dressed up in legal jargon, of course, threats, essentially, meant to force my hand. They were doing everything they could to try and undermine my decision to pursue the restraining order and push me back into their fold. The letters were carefully worded, filled with veiled threats about the financial strain my actions were causing. They implied that I was damaging the family's reputation, that I was making a mockery of everything they had worked for. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be truly threatened by someone who claimed to love you. They were no longer just words, no longer just an emotional battle. I was now facing a war on my very autonomy. The fight was no longer about me caring for them. It was about me standing firm for myself, even if it meant losing everything I had ever known. Despite everything inside of me telling me to fight back, to lash out and prove I was right, I stayed calm. I stayed silent because I had learned one thing through all of this. I wasn't fighting to win a war against them anymore. I was fighting to protect myself. I had learned something crucial in that first week after the restraining order. Silence wasn't empty. Silence was power. When I stayed quiet, when I refused to react to their every demand and every emotional plea, I took the control back. The first real test of my resolve came when I got the voicemail from my mother saying my father had been hospitalized. I was prepared for it. I had expected it. It was the exact same tactic they had used so many times before. They needed me to feel guilty. They needed me to think that I was the cause of his pain. They needed me to believe I was responsible. I listened to her message 3 times. I couldn't stop myself. But each time, the words grew more hollow, more desperate. I could hear the manipulation clearly now, as if it was an instrument I had learned to play myself. The realization hit me like a slap. I wasn't just a daughter to them. I had been a means to an end, an emotional punching bag when things didn't go their way. They weren't worried about my father's health. They were worried about losing control over me. That was when the clarity hit. I couldn't allow myself to fall back into that trap. I couldn't be the one to put out their fires anymore. I wasn't responsible for their emotions, for their lives, or for their problems. I wasn't their savior, and I wasn't their scapegoat. I was just me. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't call. Instead, I took a piece of paper and wrote a letter to myself. The words flowed out like a quiet confession, like a promise I needed to make to the person I had ignored for so long. A list of every time I had chosen them over myself. Every time I canceled my plans to take care of them. Every time I drained my savings to cover a debt that wasn't mine to pay. Every time I pushed aside my own needs because I thought theirs were more important. Every time I ignored my own boundaries to maintain the peace. Every time I accepted blame that wasn't mine to carry. I ended the letter with one simple sentence. I will not save people who are trying to destroy me. It was a powerful statement, and yet it felt so foreign. To say it out loud felt like cutting away a part of myself that I had carried for so long. But as the words settled on the page, I felt a sense of relief. A weight lifted that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was choosing myself. Weeks passed, and the court dates loomed closer. The legal process moved at a snail's pace, but I was determined. I showed up to every deposition, answered every question, and provided every document that was requested. I didn't rush. I didn't bend. I stood firm in my truth, even when their lawyers tried to twist it into something it wasn't. The battle wasn't easy. I couldn't help but feel the fatigue building up, the constant strain of fighting for something that seemed like it should have been mine all along: peace, autonomy, respect. But in the end, I had one thing they could never take away from me: my resolve. The courtroom felt colder than usual that morning. It wasn't just the sterile, impersonal air of the building, it was something deeper. The weight of what was happening, what had been happening for months, had settled into my bones, leaving me feeling both hollow and heavy at the same time. I had prepared for this moment, had visualized it in my mind countless times, but now that it was here, I realized that no amount of preparation could have made it easier. The opposing counsel's demeanor was the same as always: smug, dismissive, almost arrogant. But today there was something more to his tone, something sharper in his eyes, as if he knew this battle was nearing its end. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge, a woman with sharp eyes and an unwavering posture, listened intently to both sides, asking questions that cut through the surface of the arguments. I sat there, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying to keep my composure, trying to keep my nerves in check. Megan, my lawyer, was beside me, her eyes narrowed in concentration as she sifted through the documents in front of her. We had been over everything so many times that I could recite it all in my sleep: the emails, the phone records, the letters, the affidavits, everything. Each piece was carefully arranged, each one a testament to the years of financial and emotional manipulation I had endured at the hands of my family. But despite all of it, despite the certainty that I had the truth on my side, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something could go wrong. I knew what was coming, or at least I thought I did. The final hearing was meant to decide whether the case would go to trial or if it would be settled. But as the hours passed, I began to realize something else entirely. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This wasn't about the money or even the legal victories I had already achieved. It was about the final act of severing ties. It was about closing a door that had been open for far too long. It wasn't just about winning. It was about never looking back. I could hear my family's lawyer, the same man who had spent the last few months trying to find cracks in my testimony, trying to discredit me with every step, now presenting his last arguments. He was trying to paint me as the one in the wrong, the one who had manipulated the situation, who had forced my family into this battle. He was spinning a narrative that would have been believable had it not been for the mountain of evidence that refuted everything he said. But there was one thing I couldn't deny. His words were affecting me more than I cared to admit. I wasn't scared of him, no, but I was tired. The endless back and forth, the exhaustion of proving myself over and over again, was starting to wear on me. My thoughts were interrupted as the judge called for a short recess. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as lawyers exchanged papers and clients sat in uncomfortable silence. I stood, stretching my stiff legs, but my mind was still racing. This was it. The end was coming, and I could feel it in my bones. But I didn't know what would come next. Was there truly a next? Was there anything left for me after all this? The silence of my life now felt heavy, oppressive, even though it had once been a source of peace. Megan caught my eye from across the room. She was calm, her usual cool demeanor unwavering, but I could see the concern in the slight furrow of her brow. She approached me quietly, pulling me aside for a moment of privacy. "They're offering a settlement," she said, her voice low enough so that no one else could overhear. My heart sank. What does that mean? It means they want to avoid the trial. They're offering to drop all claims, withdraw the conservatorship, issue a public apology, and cover a portion of your legal fees. In exchange, you drop the civil suit and agree not to pursue further damages. The words hung in the air, echoing with a mix of relief and uncertainty. A settlement could be a way out, a way to avoid the prolonged public spectacle of a trial. It was tempting, but there was one thing I couldn't let go of. I don't want a settlement without an apology. Not just any apology. It has to be real. It has to be public. And it has to be under oath. The thought of them offering me anything less, especially after everything they had done, felt insulting. I needed more than just words. This wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement, about them owning their actions. Megan nodded slowly, understanding. I'll relay your conditions. The next few days felt like a fever dream. The back and forth between our lawyers and theirs was intense, but it was also strangely anticlimactic. Their lawyers had clearly underestimated me, and their desperation was becoming obvious. They wanted to end this quietly. They wanted to silence me with a few well-worded lines, and then move on as if nothing had happened. But they were wrong. I couldn't let them rewrite the narrative so easily. They had taken so much from me, my security, my sense of self, and I needed to ensure that I wouldn't be erased again. Finally, I received the document I had been waiting for, their signed statement. They had agreed to the terms, but it was everything I had feared it would be. The language was carefully crafted, as if they had consulted with an army of lawyers to make sure they didn't say too much. The apology was impersonal, sterile, filled with legalese that sounded like something they'd written to avoid consequences rather than to admit wrongdoing. But it was public. It was signed. And it was real, even if it wasn't perfect. I didn't feel a rush of triumph when I read it. I didn't feel the overwhelming sense of closure I had expected. I didn't run out to tell anyone. I simply sat there, reading it over and over again, as if I was trying to make sense of it. And in that moment, something shifted. I realized that the apology wasn't the point. It wasn't about them finally saying the words I needed to hear. It was about the absence of them, the absence of their influence, their power, their presence in my life. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt before, freedom. The days following the settlement were surreal, like I was walking through a fog that I couldn't quite shake. The world outside seemed to move in fast forward, while I was still, suspended in time. I didn't feel relief, at least not in the way I had imagined. I had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of victory after the long battle. Instead, I was left with something quieter, more subtle, a strange sense of peace that I couldn't fully understand. I took the signed apology, the final legal document, and stored it away in a drawer. It felt less like a symbol of their remorse, and more like a necessary finality, a box that needed to be checked before I could start the next chapter of my life. I told myself I didn't need to celebrate. I didn't need to run to the phone and call every friend and family member I had left, waving the paper around as proof of my success. No, I didn't want that. I didn't need the validation. I had already won, not because of the document, but because of the silence that came after. The silence wasn't an absence of noise, not at first. It was the stillness that comes after the storm, when the winds died down and the sky is eerily calm and you realize that it's over. It's that moment when you stop bracing for impact and you realize that there's nothing left to fight. It was as if the entire world had been holding its breath for years, and now I was finally allowed to exhale. But the quiet wasn't just the absence of my family's chaos. It was the absence of a constant self-doubt, the ever-present feeling that something was always wrong with me. For so long, I had internalized their accusations, their manipulation, their insistence that I was the problem. They had taken so much from me, but the one thing they had never fully stolen was my own sense of self. It had been buried deep within me, suffocated by their control, but it was still there, just waiting to emerge. I had spent so many years lost in their world, believing that I needed their approval, their love, their validation. I had convinced myself that I was broken, that I was the one who had failed them somehow. But now, with the weight of their lies exposed, I could see clearly for the first time in years. The truth was simple. I wasn't broken. I had been lied to. I had been betrayed. And now, it was time to let go of the person I thought I was and finally embrace who I was always meant to be. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moment where everything fell into place. Healing didn't come with fireworks or music swelling in the background. It didn't come with an emotional breakdown or a cathartic release. It came in small moments, moments that were mundane even. A walk in the park without feeling the weight of their guilt hovering over me. Cooking dinner for one without the feeling of loneliness creeping in. Decorating my apartment, not because I needed to forget the past, but because I was creating a space that was mine. A space I had never been allowed to have before. Every change, every small choice, felt like an act of rebellion. I was no longer trying to untangle the past. I wasn't focused on figuring out where I had gone wrong or what I could have done differently. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. The damage had been done. The truth had been exposed. And now I had to focus on rebuilding, piece by piece, my own life. One afternoon, after several weeks of quiet adjustment, I decided to do something I had been putting off for a long time. I rewrote my will. I had avoided it, not wanting to confront the reality of the future. But now, I knew it was time to take control. To make sure that my wishes, my voice, were the only ones that mattered. I added a clause designating a portion of my estate to fund legal services for women who, like me, had been caught in the web of familial financial abuse. It wasn't just a charitable act, it was a symbol. A way to take the power I had reclaimed and use it to help others. To make sure that no one else would have to endure what I had gone through. It was a way to create something good out of all the pain. I wasn't doing it for glory or recognition. I wasn't seeking a medal or praise. I was doing it because I had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side, and I wanted to be a beacon of light for others trapped in the same darkness. I began consulting with women who had been through similar battles, women who had been deceived, manipulated, and financially drained by their families. It felt good to share my story, to give them the advice I had never received. But what struck me the most was how many of them had been just like me, kind, patient, selfless women who had believed that family meant safety. They had sacrificed everything for the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally, only to be left with nothing but scars and shattered trust. I shared my story anonymously through a support network, and the responses flooded in. Messages from women across the country who were fighting the same fight, who were struggling to break free from the shackles of family loyalty, who had been made to feel that their worth was tied to their ability to take care of others, to be the rock, to be the one who always forgave. It wasn't rare. It wasn't isolated. It was happening everywhere. And that realization brought me both a sense of relief and a sense of urgency. My pain, as personal as it had felt, was no longer just my own. It had become a shared experience, and I wasn't alone anymore. As for my family, I didn't know what they were doing, and I didn't care to know. For the first time, I was no longer obsessed with what they were thinking, what they were planning. I had let go of the desire to fix things, to save them from themselves. Their consequences were theirs to bear, and I wasn't responsible for carrying them anymore. I didn't need to know their lives. I had stopped looking for them in the places I used to check. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I was no longer trying to earn their affection or prove my worth to them. I had nothing to prove. It was a strange feeling, this freedom. For so long, I had been defined by them, by their expectations, their control, their demands. But now, there was nothing left. No ties, no obligations, no strings pulling me back into their world. It was just me, and for the first time in years, that was enough. As I walked through the city or stood in line for coffee, I wondered if anyone could see the change in me. Could they tell, just by looking, that something fundamental had shifted? That I was no longer the person I had once been? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that I knew it. I felt it deep in my bones. I wasn't who I used to be, and I wasn't apologizing for it. As the weeks stretched into months, the shift in me became more apparent, not just to others, but to myself. I had spent so many years living in the shadows, existing as an extension of the people around me. I had been so willing to mold myself into whatever version of me they needed to survive their emotional manipulations. But now, each day felt like a new discovery. I was slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, the person I was always meant to be. It wasn't a process that could be rushed, and I knew that. I was learning to trust my own instincts, to honor my needs before anyone else's. I started taking small risks, the kind that felt thrilling but terrifying at the same time. I was so used to living cautiously, second-guessing every decision, constantly wondering how my choices would be received by those who had once controlled so much of my life. But now I realized I could make decisions for me without asking for anyone's approval, without worrying about the consequences that would inevitably fall back on me. I enrolled in a cooking class, something I had always wanted to do but had never had the time for, or so I told myself. I hadn't had time because I was too busy being the glue that held everything together, too busy trying to meet everyone else's needs. But now, I could afford to invest in myself. The class was small and intimate, and for the first time in years, I felt truly present. I wasn't distracted by my phone, my family's demands, or the constant ache of needing to be somewhere else. I was learning, and I was doing it for myself. It was liberating in a way I had never imagined. With each new dish I mastered, I felt like I was taking another step away from the person I used to be. I wasn't just learning recipes. I was learning how to care for myself, how to nourish myself without guilt, without the feeling that I needed to provide for anyone else. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt the old voices creeping in, the voices that told me I wasn't good enough, that I would never measure up to the ideal my family had set for me. But I pushed them aside. I had learned that I wasn't a reflection of anyone else's expectations. I was mine. And then, there was a day I decided to take a solo trip. It had been something I had dreamed of for years, but the timing had never seemed right. There was always someone who needed me, someone who would be disappointed if I didn't show up, if I didn't fulfill my role as the caregiver, the protector. But I had learned how to say no. I had learned how to choose me. So one afternoon, I booked a flight to a small coastal town I had read about years ago. It was a place known for its tranquility, its untouched beaches, and its slow pace of life. The thought of leaving felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I had always feared the idea of being alone, of stepping away from the safety net of my family's chaos. But this time, the fear was different. It wasn't paralyzing. It was the kind of fear you feel when you're standing on the edge of something new, something unknown. It was the kind of fear that meant you were on the cusp of growth. The first few days of the trip were difficult. The silence was louder than I had anticipated. I was so used to having my family's constant drama in the background that the stillness felt foreign, even uncomfortable. But slowly, the rhythm of the place began to soothe me. I walked along the beach, letting the waves crash against my feet, grounding myself in the moment. I spent hours at a local cafe, reading books I had long forgotten about, sipping coffee without any agenda or rush. I didn't check my phone every 5 minutes. I didn't feel the pressure of needing to respond to anyone. There was no one there to ask me for anything. No one to manipulate or guilt me into doing things for them. For the first time in years, I was just me. And it felt like freedom, like I was breathing in air that I hadn't known I was missing. But it wasn't just the trip itself that changed me. It was the decision to go in the first place. To prioritize my own well-being, to take control of my life in a way that I never had before. That was the real breakthrough. I wasn't just reclaiming my space, I was reclaiming my worth, my right to choose, my right to be happy. And in that small, quiet town by the sea, I realized something that I had been too afraid to admit to myself before. I was worthy of peace. I was worthy of joy. I was worthy of living a life that wasn't dictated by anyone else's needs or demands. When I returned home, I knew I had changed. I was still the same person, but I was stronger, more grounded, more at peace with who I was. I had learned to stop apologizing for my needs, to stop feeling guilty for taking up space. I had learned that it was okay to say no, and that my boundaries were sacred. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. But even as I continued to grow, there were reminders of my past. My family's influence still lingered, like a faint shadow at the edges of my life. They were still out there, still existing in the background of my world, but I wasn't as afraid of them anymore. I had learned how to create distance, emotional, mental, and physical distance. I had learned how to protect my peace. One evening, I sat on my couch, flipping through old photos. I came across one of my mother and me, taken years ago at a family gathering. We were smiling, our faces close, the kind of photo that was supposed to represent happiness. But now, when I looked at it, all I saw was the manipulation, the guilt, the unspoken expectations. It wasn't a memory of love, it was a memory of control. A memory of me being forced to play a role I didn't want. I put the photo down, not out of anger, but out of acceptance. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was free. And as I looked around my apartment, at the small changes I had made, the books on the shelf, the plants I had bought, the artwork I had hung up, I realized that I had built something new. Something just for me. My space. My life. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their love. I had built a life that was mine, and that was more than enough.